Hello, everyone. Did I startle you? Welcome to Ratio Christi Community Night. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Aaron. I'm the pastor here at this church, and we are happy to be the host church for Ratio Christi Community Nights. And maybe Anna can tell you a little bit about what Ratio Christi does. Tell us a quick summary, if you can, what Ratio Christi does, the ministry that you help lead here in Knoxville.
We are an apologetics ministry that we teach the scientific, philosophical, and historical reasons for following Jesus Christ, that he's actually real, that we really do believe it, and that this book stands up to the test. And that's all we do is answer questions and allow an environment where church folk and non-church folk alike can come and test and criticize and poke and ask questions. That's what we want.
Fantastic. So that's what Ratio Christi does. And like I said, we are super happy to host. The positions, how do we say this? The positions of Ratio Christi do not necessarily reflect the positions of the Maryville Vineyard Church, et cetera, et cetera.
That's right.
But you almost always do. So, and if not, Anna and I, we'll fight it out when no one's watching.
That's fine. We can do it from stage one time.
Why don't you guys give Anna a hand and welcome her here.
Hey, everybody. So I'm seeing a lot of really familiar faces. This will be great because this topic is really dark. Please bear with me a little bit because I got some scars on my lungs. I'm okay. And I've got if you see me take a pill up here, it's just to keep me from coughing. But this low grade kind of scratchy voice is not for effect because we're talking about demons tonight. That's what you need to know. And as usual, we are going to really deal with this topic. And then you're going to be invited to ask whatever questions you have. Okay? All right, we'll get started. If you're here, it means I didn't overwhelm you too badly last time. And that's good news, because I get a chance to overwhelm you now with yet more content that is specifically focused on the parts of the Bible that we don't talk about very often, all of which is being discussed due to our overarching theme of deconstruction this semester. Remember that's our theme. Deconstruction being the framework by which individuals who at one time believed themselves to be Christians but now have gone through some very serious crisis of thought and now realizing that they're not in fact believers. Or at the very least not certain they can continue in Christendom without having a great deal of issues clarified for them. For the individuals deconstructing, the most important aspects to these discussions that we can give them is raw, unabashed honesty. That being said, you've been warned in the promo video for tonight. There is a warning on social media for tonight, and I am warning you now in real time, and for the sake of anyone watching the YouTube video later on. Tonight's content is very, very dark, and once I place these notions in your brain, I cannot take them back out again. I'm not going to exaggerate anything for effect, but I'm also not going to make this easier than it is to spare you. If you're prone to nightmares or sleep paralysis and supernatural content gets to you, tonight's talk may completely change the way that you look at the world. And if you're okay with that, then by all means stay. And if not, we can do exactly the same thing one-on-one when you have several hours of daylight left in the day to process this stuff. Again, I'm not up here with any intention of scaring anybody. It's just the nature of the topic when you're actually dealing with it. And the fact that Americans are rarely exposed to these things in any other form except for horror movies and creepypasta stuff on Urban Myths Online. Tonight we'll actually be demystifying our theologies. But for some of us, that means that we will be facing a supernatural reality that we've worked really hard to avoid up until this point. And it's entirely up to you. And I'll not be offended in the slightest if at any point in this talk you opt out, okay? All right. Last time we learned some preliminary grounding exercises for somebody moving through deconstruction, and we will illustrate them by moving through some very weird and seemingly unnecessary parts of Scripture to our modern sensibilities. And this time around, we're going to continue under that framework with what was that last step from last time, if you recall, the cognitive behavioral therapy part. Or for our purposes, exposure therapy. In essence, we'll be rapid firing any and all major topical questions raised by those undergoing deconstruction and answering them without fleeing or beating around the bush in any way. We're going to stare what gives us pause in the face, no matter how uncomfortable, no matter how severe. no matter how unnerving. And as family and friends of loved ones going through this process, we're going to do so voluntarily and preemptively when we're able. Why? Well, because we're to mimic our Jesus who sacrificed himself on behalf of his own. And we're called to do so emphatically and repeatedly until God calls us home. So, if we practice well, we'll be able to answer those hurting, struggling around us with greater care, greater patience, greater humility, and very importantly, with the clarity that they're seeking. There is no more time for the church at large to sit back and ignore this stuff or focus exclusively on what makes people feel comfortable in their seats. Those days are gone. And I would argue never really should have been present, really, for us to answer those who are seeking with the pat answer, you just need to have more faith. It's a meaningless statement if we don't clarify what faith is and how it's grounded in something real. In this day and age, if you're going to rely on a pat answer because you can't bring yourself to have uncomfortable conversations, at least practice saying, I know there is an answer. Let's talk to someone who knows what that would be. Because at least there, we're acknowledging that their attempt at seeking is what is supposed to happen. Because what inevitably happens when we answer in the first way is that the deconstruction process gets magnified by meaningless pat answers, and well-meaning church folk who respond this way end up not only exposing their own ignorance of these things, but they also inadvertently insult the intelligence of the person seeking those answers. And what's worse is that this whole process is magnified even more, contingent upon how long the person giving the pat answer has been a Christian, as well as their role in the church. Which means if you're in leadership in any form, or you're a paragon of what is seen as a spiritual maturity in your community, and you answer in this way, it implies to the person asking the question that there isn't an answer at all. Because if there were, surely the Christians who look and act the most Christianish in the community or have been there the longest would have these answers. And if you came here with that mindset, or if you've experienced within your church home something along the lines of what I've just described, you're absolutely right to feel worried and suspicious of the church. You are trying to deal honestly and transparently with the Christian religion, and you're supposed to do that. Keep it up. Nights like this are designed expressly to serve that end. That being said, though, please, please, please be patient with your home church's leadership. You need to know that you can go all the way through seminary and never once get trained in apologetics like what we do here at Ratio Christi. It's not the role of the pastor or youth leader or worship director, etc., to have encyclopedic knowledge of the Bible. Yes, there is massive need for apologetics content from the pulpit. Yes, there is a massive Bible literacy problem in America. Yes, when you ask the average person claiming to be a Christian to give you the gospel and what comes out of their mouths is blathering, that is definitely a problem. I readily admit all of that and have been guilty of it myself. But those are discussions for another time. As it serves our purposes this evening, please do not go back to your home churches and browbeat your leadership on this material. I volunteered to do this. I'm the one inviting you to vent your frustrations and concerns. I asked for this. If you are upset with hearing some of what we are going to talk about tonight, or any of the other nights for that matter, for the first time, please do not take it out on well-meaning local congregations who may also be experiencing this for the first time. There is an entire history of denominational traditions when it comes to preaching focuses that we haven't even gotten to yet. So where I will show you the courtesy of brutal clarity of thought on all of these things, please show me the courtesy of permitting me to represent your home church's reasoning for not advertising this content so that you can understand the heart behind perhaps having done so before disparaging your home congregations. Unless you are part of a cult, the likelihood that theology was purposely withheld from you is highly unlikely. The reality is that the themes that marked the American church in the last several decades had a focus that didn't involve apologetics at all. And so those in leadership are simply unfamiliar because they didn't know they needed it yet. But I think that's changing. And that's the entire point of nights like this. If this is your first time to a Ratio Christi community night, welcome. I'm a Christian apologist, which means I spend my entire life answering questions about Christianity. Ratio Christi is interdenominational, which means we believe it is important for our apologists to not only be able to represent accurately our own respective denominational preferences, but also the preferences of everyone else's, so that it doesn't matter who's asking the question. The answer you will receive, you will be able to take home in a way that accurately represents the whole of Christianity's history, accurately understand your own upbringing, and or understand why a brother or sister in Christ does not share in your denominational heritage. Because ultimately what apologetics is, from a psychological perspective, is theological exposure therapy, which is what I alluded to doing with you all last time. Exposure therapy. An extremely helpful and outrageously successful way of healing a phobic reaction in individuals who suffer from confusion, fear, anxiety, panic attacks, you name it. The goal of the therapy is to isolate the source of the problem and then to expose the person over and over to the source of that material in a controlled environment in order to desensitize them to confusion underlying what bothers them. You explore all the facets and details of the environment that is causing the reaction. The more you get used to that cause, what causes you that fear or anxiety or panic-inducing source, the stronger and less anxious or fearful you will become when exposed to it in a non-controlled environment. The desensitizing aspect is an emotional one primarily. Clarity brings calm, and assessment of one's environment is easier when that calm is present. So for example, let's say you have a phobia of being trapped in an elevator. For you, the mere thought of an elevator raises your blood pressure. Perhaps even seeing an elevator scene on like a Netflix show makes you nauseous. You would begin this process by taking a picture of an elevator and placing it somewhere you need to see it regularly, like your refrigerator door. If that's too much, then perhaps just taking a few moments in the therapist's office to sit and have it in close proximity to you. You never move on in this stuff more quickly than the person who is having the reaction can handle. What you do is you make them uncomfortable in doses they can handle, and over time, those doses increase. So that at some point, you have them out of the office with you and facing a real elevator. And you coach them. Could you take a few steps toward the elevator? No? Then stop there and stay there until you can. Could you step into the elevator if the doors stay open? How about if the elevator doors close and the elevator stays put? How about if we move up one floor, etc.? The point is, the therapist never jump scares them. All they do is show them that they can be trusted with transparency, and that the desensitizing does and gets them to the goal of actually healing the reaction. Why does this matter? Well, because formal apologetics is, in effect, in a deconstruction type setting, precisely this: doses of theology in increasing increments that they specifically ask of us until the person experiencing trouble with content is satisfied or we can no longer move on. The vast majority of laypersons and pastors may never get exposed to scholarly detailed theological accounts because, frankly, they're boring and dry and written for other scholars to read. That's how modern academia works. What apologists try to do is synthesize academic level material and bring it down into the realm of practical theology. It's theology in sneakers. And this is important for us to get right because we want you all to not only see, but also feel that your scrutiny is invited and welcome, and that there are lifetimes of material that, if you want it, is accessible to you. And even though we have focused previously on remembering that part of this deconstruction process we're discussing is being aware that there's usually a question behind the questions being asked, we still need to honor the initial question with a straightforward answer, because to fail to do so is to risk being seen as patronizing. And if we can learn anything from this time period in the history of the church, in the same way that we do not need any more fluffy, substanceless puddle theologies, we also don't need any more pompous windbag theologians either. And we certainly do not want apologetics to be seen by those struggling as a weapon being wielded against them. So we answer the question being asked outright, while keeping in mind that the reason for asking the question to begin with is almost definitely way deeper a question than is being initially raised to us, and therefore we invite further discussion. Let me illustrate with a really common example for deconstructing Christians. Why didn't God make a world in which humans have free will, but there is no sin? In this scenario, what they're presenting with initially is a really common and really easily answered problem. What they're asking is a form of the trilemma, which is something we've dealt with ad infinitum in previous community nights. So I'm not going to delve into that subject of evil and suffering in the world, and definitely check out that video on the YouTube channel if you need it. Instead, I'm simply going to answer the question, and then I'm going to see which part of the trilemma they're actually struggling with. Because in my experience, it's about a 50-50 shot as to which facet of this issue needs clarifying. And since I can't read minds, I'll answer the exact question that was asked and then wait for them to signal where the hang-up is for them. Remember that this therapy is for their sake and not ours. This is not a time for us to show them how much theology we know or how well-read we are on other subjects. The answer to the question, why didn't God make a world in which humans have free will, but there is no sin, is that God is not able to do so. Pause. I know it sounds crazy. I see it in your face. That is actually the answer to the question they asked. And no, I'm not about to teach heresy. Based on your reactions to me just now, the notion that God is unable to do things makes your brain go, but I thought he was omnipotent. And if there are things that God cannot do, then that makes him not omnipotent. And that, loved ones, is why we clarify theology one step at a time. There are lots of things that God cannot do. And once I point this out, you will realize it is fairly obvious that we just don't think about it from this angle very often. God cannot lie. God cannot sin. God cannot cease to be God. God cannot be unjust. Omnipotence does not mean the ability to do illogical impossibilities. Omnipotence means that all things are possible for that being within the confines of their own nature. God is perfect. That means he is incapable of failing to be perfect. That's what it means. And that's why Jewish and Christian theologians have taught this for centuries. I'm not telling you anything that's unique to the history of the church. God's incapable of logical impossibility. And when you study this stuff on a formal level, logical impossibilities are part of a subset of fallacies called non sequiturs. You don't need to remember the Latin. All you need to remember is that God is incapable of doing things that would cease to make him God, including instances that defy logic itself. So, while we're at it, Anna, can God make a rock so big that he cannot pick it up? No, he cannot. Can God make a square circle? Also, no. Well, doesn't that mean that the laws of logic are in a way higher or greater than God if God himself has to abide by them? No, because logic is simply a feature of his character, just like holiness, justice, and maximal greatness is. The laws of logic are the natural expression of God's character, and they are laws insofar as they do not change because God's character does not change. Not because they are apart from God's character, binding him from the outside. Instead, they're a transcendent expression of who God is. Transcendence, for the average layperson, is something that is true even outside of our physical reality, something that applies to all peoples at all times and in all places, things that, if human beings ceased to exist, would still be true. By way of illustration, mathematics is transcendent. It's why it's a universal language, for example. It doesn't matter at what point in human history you are or whether you've set up a colony on Mars. It's universally true at all times and in all places that 1 + 1 does not equal 5. And that the times tables you memorized in second grade are all still true. And it is the presence of transcendent truths in the world that are in and of themselves one of several proofs for God's existence. A world that is comprised of exclusively material cannot produce immaterial notions like transcendent universals. Stay with me. We're not going to camp here. And if you're already bored, just take a brain break and tune out for just a second. But for the philosophy kids in the room that need this, listen to me. If we assume that all that exists is comprised of matter, how is it that transcendent laws like logic and mathematics that are by definition immaterial exist at all? This is a huge gaping problem for naturalism. Matter cannot produce anything other than matter. So immaterial truths should not exist, and yet they do, and their presence implies a transcendent mind out of which they are an extension. If you are interested in this stuff, please look up the transcendental argument for God's existence. It's the new kid on the block as far as proofs go, and it's my personal favorite. It was my undergraduate thesis. You can come talk to me about it. We love to talk about stuff like that. Check it out. Okay, enough of that. You get the point. There are things God cannot do. And this has further implications because if we go back to the original question, could not God design a world in which mankind has free will and sin doesn't exist? If the answer is no, then which of those components is a necessary factor of God's character by which he's bound? Well, it's the free will part. There's a reason free will comes up here, and it's not because it's a pat answer. It's because the freedom to will is a quintessential component of God's character and attributes. We have a tendency as humans to imagine God's attributes as emphasizing the ones we happen to prefer over the alternatives. This happens all the time in church history. The Reformation focused on sovereignty, the Puritans on holiness, and today we really only like to talk about God's love. And not just his love in all of its facets, but only on the facet we personally like best. But that isn't true. All of God's attributes are equal and essential, and love has a great deal of forms, all of which are found in God and frankly defined by God. And if we remove or imply that one of them trumps the others or is more important than the others, then God ceases to be God. And in our own minds, we begin to manufacture a God that suits our own personal preferences and which rapidly devolves into a completely false concept of who he is. Why does this clarification matter? Well, because God created us in his image and in his likeness. God is both perfect love and free to will. And that means he's bound by the inability to coerce. This means that automatically we must assume that when he says that he is creating human beings in his image, that we should expect that in order to do this consistently with who he is, that human beings must be imbued with the freedom to will themselves. But in particular, for our purposes in this evening's topic, the freedom to reject his love, the freedom to literally spurn him. And what I'm getting at is this here. Whether we are deconstructing Christians or Christians in general, if you are exposed to the youth group talk where the answer to the question, why do we have free will, was answered with some sort of talk involving the phrase, God didn't want to create puppets, your youth leader didn't mislead you or shortchange you. They just may not have given you the details you were needing. Let me rephrase what they were getting at. God not only did not desire to create puppets, God was necessarily creating humankind consistent with his nature. Human free will is not an accidental attribute of humans. It isn't an arbitrary attribute of humans. Human free will is a necessary requirement for humans if God is bound by an inability to lie and is simultaneously claiming that he is making humans in his image. So Anna, you're telling me that God cannot make mankind in his image while simultaneously removing their ability to choose sin. Correct. It is impossible for the situation to be otherwise without God ceasing to be God, which he is incapable of doing. The best he could do is to have a creation that is not in his image, so basically just like animals and plants and inanimate objects, life in general, but not humanity in particular. So why would God create mankind if he knew that they would have the capacity to reject him, and that in fact a great deal of them would reject him and plummet creation into the mess that it's in? Well, presumably because he knew that it could not be otherwise, had a plan consistent with his own perfect nature to successfully persuade a population of humans to freely choose to love him in return, in spite of the circumstances those who had rejected him placed them all in. And ultimately, because he would rather have us alive experiencing eternal joy in his presence at the expense of temporary but necessary pain than to not have us at all. Remember that when God created humans, he fashioned a unique creature of incredible worth and dignity. There are other creatures, supernatural ones that we're going to talk about shortly, that it seems were also created with the ability to choose, to accept or reject God, but they, as far as we know, were created with an entirely different focus. Where the story behind their creation and spirit is less discussed, the story behind ours is that we not only received spiritual life in the form of a soul, but also corporeal life in the form of a body. A bodily form that God himself takes on as part of the larger divine rescue framework to deliver those of us who choose to accept the parameters of our creation and turn to him for redemption. A bodily form that in the person of the Son of God, Jesus Christ, is in even now and will remain forevermore. Have you ever thought about that from that angle? Our bodies matter to God. They matter immensely. They matter so much that not only do we begin existence embodied, but we will also spend eternity after final judgment embodied. Part of the discomfort we feel at the thought of dying is that we were not designed to die or be disembodied. It is a completely unnatural and therefore unnerving reality we face that's the natural result of our rejection of our Creator and therefore our design. And it's in the intermediate state, that part of existence for us that comes after physical death here on earth, but before the final judgment, when we are re-embodied, where we experience yet another impermanent state, where our disembodied selves will go to be with whichever supernatural being we desire to be with in life. Jesus in one place, or the ones that's decided they didn't want to be with Jesus as much as we did in a place that is as far from God as is logically possible to get. Whether you are a believer or not, when all of this world comes to an end, everyone will be re-embodied in the glorified form of what we have now, and they will spend the rest of eternity in whatever experience they prefer. One place for those who love Yahweh, and one for those who don't want anything to do with him. You see, the reason theologians often use the term twin rebellion to describe the rejection some of God's supernatural creatures have with God and humanity's rejection is because both parties have exactly the same problem with their Creator: hubris. It's exactly the same. At some point in their existence, grappling with the reality of the free options before them, both angelic beings and humans begin saying things like, if I were God, I wouldn't have created the universe this way. And then a mock trial of God's character begins erupting in our brains, testing here and there for whether or not we think he's worthy of worship, or perhaps speculating that he isn't as powerful as he claims to be. Or maybe he just isn't that great after all. And so for those of us that continue operating in this state of hubris, do not past tense reject God. We active tense continually reject God. And that active tense rejection naturally extends into the afterlife. The people who go to hell want to be there. Do you realize that? The phrase you hear in fire and brimstone type sermons about God angrily sending misbehaving children to hell is only true in the most basic sense, that yes, God is sovereign and consistent with his nature, as we have already established, and therefore it's necessary for there to be a location in which those who don't want to be with him don't have to be. But it isn't true in the sense that God is holding you by a string over hell, waiting for you to mess up enough to cut the thread. There's nothing like that in Scripture. Did you know that? How much of our understanding of hell comes from old sermons out of which the cultural context is lost? Dante's Inferno, Milton's Paradise Lost. You want to be really honest? How much of your understanding of hell and the spiritual forces of evil comes from the Keanu Reeves Constantine movie? How much of it comes from a childhood watching South Park? If you are a deconstructing Christian, I would like to suggest to you that perhaps part of the problem is that you are rightly rejecting a completely false notion of what hell is or why it exists. So let's talk about hell for a minute from the perspective of the biblical authors. Whoa, okay, Anna, stop. My survey of old world religion professors said that the Jews don't believe in an afterlife at all. So you're losing me. Well, your professor is technically correct, but it's genuinely a technicality. And I'm being really nice there. And if they phrased it to you that way and just left it there, your professor was being misleading. Our Jewish writers of the Old Testament were not really concerned with giving details about what happens after we die because their focus on priorities didn't really need to dwell on it. The vast majority of the Old Testament is narrative about people who were alive and are crucial components in how God is redeeming the hot mess of this world with a coming Messiah. Those works are not intended to clarify what happens after death. But in spite of all of this, they are fairly clear that after death, you don't cease to exist. You go instead into a place called the realm of the dead. The Jewish concept of the afterlife was a place they called Sheol, and it was a location with different designations. Sheol can mean and be used in a generic sense, simply meaning physical death in general, and it's also used in a particular senses that note that those who do not belong to God go to a part of Sheol that is overtly desolate, miserable, and where special supernatural spirits make their home. So even though material constituting a Jewish concept of hell isn't super elaborated upon like it is in the New Testament, that doesn't mean that they didn't have one. They absolutely did. And in fact, in 250 BC, when 70 Jewish scholars set out to translate the Old Testament into Greek so that new converts could read it and understand what was going on, the Greek word they used to describe the bad version of Sheol was Hades. So again, your professor is technically correct. But if they camped out on that technicality and acted like there wasn't a ton of alternatively pertinent information on this subject, you were probably misled by someone who was either repeating something they heard elsewhere and never studied themselves, or knew what they were doing and had an agenda to purposely withhold that information. I'm sorry that that's the world we live in. You have to test the claims of people acting like an authority. Just because they appear to you as an authority does not mean that they're right. People that self-elect to put on microphones and tell you what's going on in the world, they should be under so much scrutiny that it's painful. You cannot blanket trust in this world. Too many people have microphones and audiences. You have to test them. Okay, so if the Jews didn't give us a whole lot of detail in the Old Testament about hell, then why do we have information at all about it that's even developed? Well, because the vast majority of the content surrounding hell was given to us by Jesus himself. The very person to spend ample time and effort explaining and emphasizing what happens to those who reject Yahweh is in fact Yahweh incarnate. And what Jesus emphasized is that those who reject God, and consequently God's redemption plan on their behalf, end up in a place where there is significant discomfort. Jesus uses descriptors of hell as everlasting darkness and things like a place where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And in one of the most incredible moments of the gospel accounts, Jesus allows us to look into hell and observe a rich man who has recently died's perspective of what he is experiencing. The story of the rich man and Lazarus is not a parable. That's a narrative account. And what is so unnerving about that account is that it adds an element to the experience of hell that had yet to be discussed, a feeling of perpetual thirst. So what we have from Jesus is a highlight of what it is like to be as far away from him as humanly possible. Sorrow so profound it's tormenting, and thirst in a place that is perpetually dark. And considering that Jesus teaches that he is the light of the world and the giver of the water of life, and that his presence is itself joy, this seems right on par to me. Rationally speaking, if you don't want anything to do with God himself and you're an eternal soul, then that's precisely what we should expect when you find yourself the furthest away from God as you can get in this existence. If what Jesus has to say is true, then all of this makes perfect sense by way of expectation. Yeah, but Anna, I know you're regularly teaching that we cannot trust our feelings and we have to regularly subject them to scrutiny because our hearts are deceitful, but don't you still have that underlying feeling that hell just seems way beyond the scope of what humans who reject Christ should experience? Doesn't it come across as excessive? Yeah, I think I do know what you're picking up on. What you're feeling is another aspect that is rarely discussed in our culture. So it isn't true that what is experienced there by humans is unnecessary, but what I think you're getting at is a feeling that the magnitude of the location seems higher than it should be for limited, finite human beings. And that's because hell wasn't originally designed at all for humans. It was designed for rebellious members of God's angelic host who are actively choosing to rebel against him and thwart what they perceive as his plans for maintaining power. Remember that these guys are more powerful and capable than humans and who are actively seeking to unseat God. The hubris that I mentioned earlier in this talk that is shared between humans and fallen angelic host was initially that they believed they'd make better gods than their creator. And it's that hubris that they share with us that they are regularly appealing to in their attempts to mislead human beings in general. But the point is that hell was made for a completely different type of being. These are supernatural, immortal, powerful entities that have the unrelenting desire to not only defy Yahweh, but who have determined to use their power to turn the hearts and minds of humans off of their creator and onto themselves as many false gods. And they want you to follow them there, to worship them there. Let me set the stage here to illustrate what I'm saying. I'm going to use that framework we introduced you to last time because it's the most detailed option out there to get your brain wrapped around the story of creation from an angelic viewpoint instead of a human one. And because if you want more information, there is an exhaustive list of material available for you to verify these things. So let me set the stage, and then we're going to come back to the hell discussion, remember that we are about to jump into a cosmic perspective of the world instead of a human one, and going to try to remove some misconceptions from your mind so that you can deal with hell in a conceptually accurate way. So try to strip from your mind right now what you think you already know, and let me guide you through just the scriptures for a minute, using this analytical framework. I'm going to use the term supernatural entity to describe the angelic host from here on out, because if I don't, this is going to get confusing. Because ultimately what we are trying to break down are snapshots we receive throughout the Bible of how God has determined to order creation. And he's elected to create supernatural administrators to do so. Just as a king has a court, so too the Most High has his own. The word angel is a title. It means messenger. And the scriptures use it that way. You can have humans acting as angels, you can have supernatural beings acting as angels, and you can even have God himself acting as an angel. Which is why folks get confused when they get to these segments of scripture where those terms are used interchangeably. There are lots of different types of supernatural entities, and we need to clarify them a bit here in order to grasp what we're dealing with. The point being, though, is that when God created these things, he did so with the purpose of communing with them, just like he did with us. But these things are not like us and have powers and capabilities that we do not. For one, they're often disembodied and have the ability to move back and forth between the spiritual realm and the earthly realm. Whatever they are, they do not have powers that are unique to God himself, things like omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence. So they're definitely more powerful on a magnitude that far outreaches us, but they are definitely not anywhere near the magnitude of Yahweh. Which is why you see when these supernatural administrators are being referenced, you see terms like sons of God in the scripture, or even God's plural lowercase g. This doesn't mean that this is a polytheistic thing. These guys are created. They are not in any way divine like Yahweh, but they have qualities that are supernatural, and there appears to be a hierarchy amongst their ranks, and we're going to get to why that matters here in a moment. We're not told the exact moment that God created these supernatural entities because the creation narrative in Genesis focuses on explaining things from a human perspective. God's creation, we are told, is good, though, and the story progresses. These supernatural entities have free will. If you grew up hearing that angelic beings do not have free will, please know that that is completely false. This is a good example of where tradition accidentally becomes dogma in a culture. Supernatural entities are free to will just as we are, and they regularly do. They make decisions, act volitionally. They can even appear in differing forms dependent upon their roles and tasks. They're just as free as we are to align ourselves with our Creator or to reject him. And there is a significant grammatical evidence that when God is speaking in Genesis and says, "Let us make man in our image and in our likeness," he is not exclusively speaking in terms of the Trinity. He is also addressing the supernatural entities in his court, watching him create us and witnessing his delight in having done so. The story progresses to God creating the Garden of Eden. If you do a comparative analysis of why those words were chosen, cross-referencing them with other descriptions in the Bible of Eden, you'll notice that Eden is also referenced as mountainous and as the land where Yahweh himself communes with creation. The Garden of Eden is not some arbitrary location. The garden, as would have been understood by the ancient audience, was where God himself dwelt. He walks among his creation there. It is his temple grounds. This isn't a contradiction. They're all true. The visual you should be seeing in your brain is that Eden is the palisade of a spiritual realm. It is the bridge point between embodied creation and disembodied creation, between humans and supernatural entities. It is where God's administration conducts business and where God delights in showing his creation what life with him is like. And for a time, humans and supernatural entities were able to commune freely with the delight of Yahweh alongside of us. Until at some point, the first instance of hubris is documented. One of the supernatural entities decided to intervene in an interaction God has with one specific human, Eve. God gives Eve and her husband clear instructions in a way they are able to comprehend in order to navigate a creation that is infinitely more complicated than they could ever process. God tells them that they can eat anything they like except one specific food, the fruit of the tree in the very center of what unites the realms, a tree whose fruit is called the knowledge of good and evil. A concrete representation of the freedom of will to reject God and to act in a way that says, I do not believe you have my best interest in mind. I would like to decide for myself whether or not I can do that job better than you. Because as we know, evil has not come into the world yet as an actionable thing. Evil at this point was simply a potential. If you grew up believing that there was some prerequisite, unspoken creation of evil as a substance or another cosmic being, that there is for the purpose of misleading mankind in a garden, that's not true. God did not create evil. Evil is not a substance, and it's not a person or a supernatural entity. Evil is simply turning away from God. And turning away from God is a necessary aspect to our and these supernatural entities' ability to have an authentic relationship with our Creator and each other as part of God's spiritual and earthly family. So if you are deconstructing right now, and the reason you're doing so is because you're under the impression that God created the devil for the express purpose of some childish experiment to see if humans would obey him, the answer to your objection is that God did not do that. Not at all. What happened was one of the supernatural entities present, and it appears from the text that this was part of the hierarchy of administrators called guardian spirits, and who had more information than Eve, but substantially less than God, decided he would make a go at impressing these weaker members of the family with what he knew. It does not say for certain, but one of the things the text suggests was that this specific entity was placed there specifically with the job of being guardian over Adam and Eve. So this entity, who is described as Ha-Satan, which is a title, again, and not a name, inflates himself in his hubris to give Eve information that is only partially true. God had already told her what she needed to know about what would happen. This supernatural entity decided to give her more information in the form of a correction, implying in his delivery that God is being misleading and that she should go for it and get her husband to have some too. The great irony here being that the only person who did have all of the information and did present it truthfully and in a way that everybody could apprehend is God himself. And after she takes it upon herself to make actionable the potential for evil, she does what everyone who has ever given in to their hubris does. She magnifies it by persuading others to do the same. And so Adam also makes actionable his potential and defies God's good word. The result of this first rebellion is that sin enters the world. The supernatural entity in the garden is punished for his folly. He stepped out of the bounds of his appointed place, and he is stripped of features of his design and made to crawl on his belly for the rest of his life. Notice how God in this narrative gets upset at him first, before he describes what is about to befall Adam and Eve. If his job was to watch over them and he used his position to do the exact opposite of what he was tasked with doing, this makes total sense. He is also told that because of this, he is banished into a realm where there will be constant enmity between his offspring, both literally and figuratively, as he now represents the first time hubris became actionable. But not only this, he's also expelled from God's administration. And this is noteworthy because the text alludes that this expulsion has a double meaning. The cursing of this entity to the ground is not only physically in the dirt, it's also that this particular entity is being sentenced to the supernatural level of ground, the realm of the dead. The demoted supernatural guardian is now to be associated with hubris toward God, antipathy toward humanity, and dominion over the earth. This is why serpentine imagery is throughout the Bible as emblematic of rebellion and evil, and finally, why members of consequent rebellions are referred to in this way. One of the takeaway cultural connections I want you to get here, though, is that the scriptures don't say that the serpent in the garden was Satan with a capital S. That guy comes in later. And the reason he is given that name, as opposed to simply using the title one who speaks adversely, is because that guy has taken hubris toward God and antipathy toward humans to a whole new level with his rebellion. In Matthew 16, when Jesus responds to Peter's rebuke of the plan for him to enter Jerusalem, to suffer, die, and then be resurrected with the harsh command, "Get behind me, Satan," Jesus isn't losing his temper. Peter, his most vocal disciple, is taking issue with the fact that the messianic plan Jesus is laying out for them is not the plan that Peter himself is expecting. And so Peter is demonstrating in real time in front of the other disciples that he values his plans more than God's. This is a direct reflection of the exact same hubris that tumbled this world into this mess. And Jesus responds to this overindulgence with precisely what is needed to end that nonsense, but by calling him out about what he is reflecting, the adversary. And in particular, the great adversary, the particularly powerful divine entity that took hubris to an entirely different level, full and open warfare. Only 3 chapters after the initial rebellion of one of God's administrators, we arrive at Genesis 6, where a second rebellion of administrators has occurred. A group of supernatural entities decide they're going to crank up the hubris a bit more and make images of themselves in the only way they can think to do, to use the vehicle responsible for perpetuating sentient life, the wombs of human women. And so they transgress the boundaries of their offices by interbreeding with humans and producing what is documented as a race of giants called the Nephilim. The result of this occurring plays into the increasing exercise of evil upon the world. These supernatural entities are taking for themselves the role of pseudo-creators, attempting to make images of themselves by abusing the most vulnerable and beloved of the Most High. And the great irony here is that they don't actually have the power to really create. All they can do is abuse and mar the designed function of humanity's initial command to be fruitful and multiply, and they use it to attempt to multiply themselves. We know from elsewhere in Scripture that one of the bragging points of the enemies of Israel is that they can trace their lineage back to the Nephilim. Goliath, for example, is documented as one of those people. The narrative of David and Goliath is much deeper than you may realize because it has implications on a supernatural level, not just a human one. But the critical component here is that, biblically speaking, Satan, with a capital S, is linked to the leader of the supernatural entities that did this. And that he was the one to come up with the idea, persuade other supernatural entities to join him, and then he led a mass rebellion out of heaven to earth to accomplish this task. The reason evil grew exponentially, such that biblical writers note that there wasn't a person alive at this time who didn't have pure evil in mind except a single man, Noah, who was still faithful to Yahweh, was that these supernatural entities were teaching their hybrids and followers all the things that they knew about amassing for themselves earthly kingdoms. This rebellion was an attempt to create civilizations that they could control and have creatures that would worship them as though they were Yahweh themselves. In early Mesopotamian explanations about how humans acquired the knowledge needed to do things like metallurgy, astronomy, meteorology, etc., all the way down to even the art of cosmetics, were due to these supernatural entities training their worshipers with information that they would not have acquired otherwise. The flood was not God making a mistake. It wasn't him losing his temper. It was him intervening on behalf of the remnant who had not chosen to abandon him. And from the cosmic perspective, it was showing the rest of the divine council that he will not be mocked. Supernatural entities are not free to abuse humans forever, whether it's being done willingly or not. They are not free to use their accelerated knowledge of design of the cosmos to multiply evil and to teach humans how to hurt themselves and sin at a higher magnitude than they would have done on their own. And just in case anyone else was considering joining with this particular rebellion, they got to be reminded that creatures, both supernatural and natural, don't actually compete with him. They just think they do. And at least when they allow their hubris to take the reins as the driving force behind how they choose to wield their freedom of will. Now, as the implications of all that we're being discussed so far begins to settle in, you can begin to understand the relationship between the level of rebellion and unbridled horror that they volitionally and repeatedly released upon Yahweh's earthly family and the destination that God prepared for them for having done so, hell. The very things that these entities were designed to administer over and protect in reflection of the holiness of God, and with respect to the profound perfection of a balanced design for the created order of the cosmos, they instead persuaded to join in their rebellion and continue to make moves and headway toward the belief that very soon they instead might be like Yahweh himself, the Most High. And so over and over, Satan and his cohorts plot rebellion after rebellion after rebellion. And those who question God's authority on the human level do the same, sometimes working together overtly and sometimes working together covertly. At the Tower of Babel, they do so overtly. So too in Joshua, when we're told that God's remnant will have to face more Nephilim, but this time it will be an outright war. In Judges, when each of the leaders of the remnant give in to their hubris chronically, plunging the people of God into despair. In the rising and falling of nations and empires like Assyria and Babylon, that are documented as having been built under the auspices of these fallen spiritual entities, etc. Which brings us back to our initial topic of hell. Why does it feel like the magnitude of hell as the place one goes who disobeys God feel heavy-handed? Or for some of us feels like the punishment for our sin is too severe? That God may be going above and beyond what is really necessary here? Well, for several reasons. First and foremost, American culture regularly conflates two places that the Bible keeps separated: hell and then the lake of fire at the end of all things after the final judgment when the earth is remade and Eden is restored. As it sits right now, when each of us dies, our physical bodies decay back to the dust out of which they were formed. But the part of us that is still eternal and remains that way, the part we call our soul, moves into a state called the intermediate state. This state is not permanent. It is a temporary holding ground in which we wait for the end of all things, where our bodies will be resurrected in an incorruptible form, restoring us back to our original design as eternal embodied beings, as it was before the fall. And we will either enjoy being back in an Edenic state with Yahweh, or we will go be with the supernatural beings that decided they did not want to be a part of the first Eden and certainly want nothing to do with the restored one. Hell is the location set aside for these guys as their realm, and it is here that anyone else joining in their rebellion will await the final judgment. For free creatures to decide that they reject Yahweh, both human and non-human alike, they will experience until the end of this age a place that is as far away from God as they can get. But pay close attention, this realm of the resentful dead will have as an environment what is the only logically expectant environment we can imagine: dark, joyless, desolate, misery, and anguish. Not because that is Yahweh inflicting that upon anyone, but because it is the necessary and natural consequence of rejecting light, joy, healing, and living water. It's only punishment in the sense that Yahweh will let you have your way. You wanted to be away from him, so be it. And the images of evil spiritual beings inflicting tortures upon these individuals is precisely what you should expect. That's precisely what they do and have done for the entirety of human history. Why would you expect anything otherwise in death if you were delighted in following them in that way in life? But Anna, what about all the fire and brimstone stuff? Where does that come from? Well, primarily it comes from Jesus referring to what happens in the end when hell itself is destroyed. Hell's not permanent. No one knows how long exactly it will last, but it's definitely not permanent. In the end, it gets completely destroyed in what is described as a lake of fire. Jesus uses descriptors like the word Gehenna for this place, a geographical reference point for the valley of Hinnom, which was famously and regularly on fire. Initially, it was the spot where leaders in the book of Judges were succumbing to the evil entities driving their hubris and were burning their own children in fires they had created in the valley. But in Jesus' time, it had become that place where trash was incinerated regularly. The point being that fire was a destructive feature of that environment. So destructive, fire being a feature of final judgment for the evil ones should be coming to mind, but not necessarily hell itself as we know it. Which brings us to the second reason that fire and brimstone are synonymous in our minds with hell. And it's for a reason that is not destructive in the lake of fire sort of way, but is the natural consequence of being as far away from God as one can possibly get while remaining spiritually intact. The description of feeling God's anger as a type of burning. Remember that when you're reading through these scriptures, you're getting a picture of physical description of a spiritual reality. This is why fire and brimstone preaching changes with every generation. Some more literal depictions because they'll be understood by the contemporary audience better, and some with more symbolic depictions because that is instead what the contemporary audience needs. For instance, how does a disembodied spirit burn exactly? Our knowledge of what this means requires flesh, but a spirit doesn't have that. And how precisely does this fire burn in complete and total darkness without giving off light? Do you see what I mean? When someone who is a teacher of this text is trying to communicate with you the depth of horror that Jesus himself is depicting, it's exceptionally difficult to get precise. Remember earlier that when we set up that there are things that God cannot do without ceasing to be God. Well, one of them is that he cannot cease to be omnipresent, which in effect, metaphysically speaking, there's nowhere one can go to get completely away from him, including hell. I've been purposely phrasing myself in terms like as far away from Yahweh as possible for that reason. All that can logically change in that our experience of God's attributes can be described differently dependent upon which facet of that attribute we're facing. For our purposes this evening, and because we're running out of time, we're going to just focus on the one our culture likes the most. God being the epitome of love, and how our culture regularly forgets to talk about all of the features of divine love and not just the fuzzy ones. Many people through time have pointed this out, that the opposite of love is not anger, it's apathy or complete indifference, which means one of the ways love is expressed is in anger. And if we think about this for just a minute, it is self-evident that this is the case. When God self-describes what he is experiencing when his creatures rebel, the illustrations he uses are things like what a parent feels when he finds his children are being abused, and what a lover feels when they find their spouse has betrayed them. Anger is an actionable feature of true love. And if God is love, and God is omnipresent, and you are wanting to get as far away from him as humanly possible, the furthest experience of God will be the natural result of said spurning. He will let you have your way. He will not restrain the natural consequences of your decision. You will experience a reality that is marked by pure, unbridled self-destruction, where the only experience of God you will be subject to is how love is expressed when you hurt it the deepest. What is experienced in hell by those within it, be it angelic or human, is not to be viewed as a material punishment applied from without, but is rather the dreadful picture of the inward spiritual consumption of a tormented conscience unraveling exponentially from within. God does not send people to hell. They go there volitionally. And the scriptures are clear here that those who find themselves there will recognize the rightness of their fate. The path they choose is the one that takes hubris to its final and most poignant reality, experiencing what it feels like for Yahweh to respect your decision to be as truly separate from him as is logically possible. If you are in this audience and have deconstructed over the concept of hell, please understand that what you may have failed to take into account is that the sinner's suffering in hell does not result in a feeling of regret over his or her guilt, but is actually provides occasion for a further experience of it, an increase of it. No one in hell is recognizing their guilt and responding to it appropriately, which would be repentance. Instead, what happens in this place is that the occupants of hell, both supernatural and human, hate God because he eternally frustrates their own quest for godhood and happiness without him. And it's here where a positive feedback loop is born. Hatred of God is in and of itself sin, and it is in their continued hatred of God that feeds their store of guilt. That increased store of guilt turns back into yet further increased hatred, and so on and so forth over and over again repeatedly. And it is in this increase of unrepentant sin that further encapsulates them from ever being able to atone for what they've done, because they continue to heap yet more guilt of sin upon their heads. And yet even here in this place of complete and total rejection of the Creator and what he has planned for you, there is yet mercy in that God does not plan on putting an end. God does plan on putting an end to all of it by casting hell and all of its perpetually infernal occupants finally into utter and complete destruction. The reason the lake of fire is the final resting place for the occupants of hell is that it's the only logical place for them to go. And when we stop to realize this, we see that far from the punishment of hell being a place where justice is exacted in some excessive way, the sufferings of sinners in the lake of fire actually can only approximate a true satisfaction of God's attribute of perfect justice. The lake of fire is as close as finite creatures can get to satisfying an infinite debt. Do you remember our talk about acquiring for oneself a fine of infinite debt? It was a while ago, so I understand if you don't. Let me just quickly remind you, okay? I showed you a proof for why God's redemption plan for having us must include payment for sin that is of infinite value. If you want to review it, you can. It's still up on the YouTube channel, but essentially it goes like this. When you break a law, you offend a society. The result, if you live in a just society, is that you must pay back to the society what you owe for that offense, either in the form of a monetary fine or in incarceration. We all understand how this works. Taking this principle to its cosmic level, when we sin, what is happening is that we are offending not a society, but instead an infinite being, God himself. In so doing, our offense and what we have accrued by way of our debt is infinite as well. How does a finite being, a creature, be it human or supernatural, ever pay back a debt that is by definition impossible for that creature to pay back? The answer is that they can't. It's impossible. Someone of infinite value must do it for them. For believing Christians, Christ being both God and man is the only one who can offer satisfaction for a debt of infinite worth. His sacrifice was both infinite in value and also finite in duration of time. Don't miss this. Christ took upon himself the sins of believers, and the amount of time he suffered on their behalf was terrible, but it wasn't permanent. And it wasn't excessive. It was exactly just, and his suffering and death on the cross was an exact correlation to the amount of sin he was atoning for. He suffered, yes, but it did end. The reason why this clarification matters is to help you understand that God's justice being exacted on people who have rejected their only hope for atonement is not excessive in the fact that it's permanent. It's permanent because they keep on sinning and adding yet more debt to their names. It goes on forever for them because they won't stop amassing it for themselves. Without Christ, the closest those who have rejected him in hell can come to paying the debt owed to justice is to suffer without end. They're doing this to themselves. They are experiencing the punitive nature of the lake of fire because the satisfaction for justice is never met. God is not being excessive. He's not rendering a sentence of life in prison for a parking violation. God is exacting the punishment for crimes that are being tallied by the occupants of the lake of fire's continued, driving, unrelenting rage against the reality that Yahweh really is who he is, the Most High. And reality cannot be otherwise. Raging against this unmovable fact is as illogical as going outside and raising your fist to the sky to rage against the law of gravity. It will change nothing about the parameters in which we find ourselves. And so it's under this framework, now that we have this information, that I think you need in order for us to do the rapid fire things that we did like last time, those odd Bible passages. Because now that we have done all of this work to get what I hope is for you a more accurate depiction of what is going on in this world than when you initially arrived this evening. Let's begin with the scapegoat offering, involving the demon Azazel in the wilderness for the Day of Atonement festival, Yom Kippur, Leviticus 16. This ritual was emblematic and representative of several things. The first is that the Israelites had an understanding of cosmic geography. You'll recall the rebellions I was referencing earlier, led by supernatural entities and designed by human rebels. One of the ones was the Tower of Babel, after which the nations were scattered. And as we were told in Deuteronomy, Yahweh disinherits the nations, but keeps Israel as his portion, the one over which he will preside, while the other rebellious live under the continued control of these hubristic supernatural entities. Out of this comes a cosmic geographical dominion map where the Israelites refer to these other nations as under the control of gods they do not know. That's why that's in there. And one of the features of this map is that the wilderness becomes synonymous with a place where these spiritual entities walk around unchecked, because the wilderness is the closest proximal location living people can get to the realm of the dead without actually dying. Spiritual entities that are ultimately led by Satan, whose alternative name is Azazel. The goat for Azazel was not that something was owed to the demonic realm, as though this sacrifice was on behalf of or to give credibility to Satan being legitimate. The goat for Azazel banished the sins of the Israelites to the realm that was outside Israel on a cosmic geographical level. The high priest was not sacrificing to Azazel. Rather, Azazel was getting what belonged to him: sin in representative form. Okay, so what about the medium at Endor? Successfully contacting an already dead Samuel to enter what is effectively a seance with Saul, the king of Israel. This one's actually pretty straightforward. Necromancy is real and has been something that the Nephilim taught humans how to do. God warns us not to practice these things because we have no control over what answers our invitations from the other side when we conduct successful seances. The irony of this story is that Saul, who is trying to convince himself that he's a paragon of righteousness, goes and does precisely what he is not only to do, he goes and does precisely what he's not supposed to do, only to find out through several different levels of sin that what he fears is going to actually happen will happen. He's going to die. And any honest self-reflection would have revealed that without opening himself up to dangerous and heinous disobedience to Yahweh. Now, does this mean that all mediums are legitimate? Absolutely not. Fraud is everywhere and in every form. In fact, one of the funny details of this particular story is that the medium is noted as being surprised and concerned that the seance actually worked, implying that she was acting fraudulently. But since it was Samuel, one of Yahweh's prophets, being invited, God permitted the situation to end with his prophet speaking from beyond the grave. But it wasn't because the medium was actually successful in and of herself. It was because God was overseeing the event directly. Okay, Anna, so what about demons? We haven't even broached that subject yet. Are they real? And what are they? Yes, they're real. And they're the lowest and least powerful form of supernatural entity. According to the frameworks I've introduced in this talk, demons are not fallen angels. Demons are the disembodied parts of supernatural beings that are left over after a Nephilim dies. Remember that the Nephilim are those hybrid creatures that members of the divine council successfully produced by having sex with human women. I have no idea what the physiological and metaphysical details are of this union or how it breaks down. But the understanding was that the human and therefore mortal elements of this merger would ultimately die, and that the eternal whatever part was left over had nowhere to go, because it was neither an intermediate state entity nor was it fully angelic. And so it was simply left to find some other vessel to host it still, because it's still valued being embodied in a human form. Equally so, these were entities that were entirely at the behest of malicious supernatural beings like Satan, and so you could expect that if they chose you as a host, it was not going to be pleasant. The good news is that if you're a Christian, it's impossible for you to be both the host of demons while Yahweh is living in you. So the only folks who need to fret about this are the ones that don't know him. There's evidence that one of the features of King David that was striking was his ability to identify demons and cast them out. There's also evidence that part of the Lord bestowing a measure of wisdom higher than anyone before him exponentially multiplied that power in David's son Solomon. By the time we get to the 1st century, Judaism had a fairly robust understanding of demonology, and one of the markers of why casting out demons is such a feature of Christ's ministry is that for the first time in centuries, we have a feature of messianic expectation that no other Christ claimant had been able to pull off: the authentic expulsion of real demons from his midst. And not only that, but the demons in his midst are verbally acknowledging that they already know who he is, that he belongs to Yahweh, and that they're confused that he's apparently showing up faster than they expected him to. I'm of course referencing the thousands of demons that had selected 2 men as their hosts and recorded as the incident of the Gerasene demoniacs. Yeah, but Anna, aren't all those quote-unquote exorcisms in the New Testament really just Jesus healing mental illnesses and neurological disorders like epilepsy? No, but some of them are. Some of them are just Jesus healing people with genuine, purely clinical, non-demonic psychological problems. The confusion stems from the fact that Greek doesn't specifically delineate the two grammatically. It delineates the two contextually. And you have to be able to tell the difference, knowing that there are interactions with demons with a capital D, and expelling demons, meaning healing otherwise non-overt internal clinical problems. How do you tell the difference? That's easy. Jesus physically touches the people with medical ailments. He does not come in physical contact with someone who needs an actual exorcism. The exorcism's done verbally. Do you see how easy all of the supernatural elements become in the scriptures if you understand the context of what's being recorded there? That's our hermeneutic circle from last time. Can you tell that you don't need any of this information in order to understand the main and plain things that Christianity teaches about the reality we face now, how we're redeemed, and what redeems us? You don't need any of this detail in order to understand the gospel. You have functioning eyes and a functioning brain. Look around you. You know this isn't all there is to the world. You know that this repetitive, mundane, cyclical, rebellious world is not everything that exists. We know. And so it's after all of this heavy theology that I will show you the only thing I can think of doing that will amount to showing you the respect I have for your intelligence right now as a sister in all of this, and having to come to terms with my own hubris that I sometimes try to convince myself is just skepticism. When the question comes to my mind, if I were God, I bet I could do better. I stop and I subject myself to the same criteria I try to subject all claims. Or apologists. Pure logic. And pure logic says that that claim, my claim, is a falsifiable claim. Just like any other that we would judge with every level of scientific scrutiny. The logical response to the claim, if I were God, I bet I could do better, is to say, all right, create a universe, and we'll test that hypothesis. And it is there that I'm forced to face reality. I am incapable of creating a universe. I am incapable of testing that hypothesis. And therefore, it is illogical of me to allow myself to operate under the notion that I would do better than the creator of the one I find myself in. It's entirely possible that what I am experiencing right now, what he has taken the time to explain to me, and what he has promised me that he is doing about what I'm experiencing is entirely the best and greatest iteration of all possible realities. And the evidence this is so is staring me directly in the face in the pages of this book and in the privacy of the conscience of my own mind. And since this is so, I feel a burden of taking all these things that we've discussed tonight and bringing them to their necessary conclusion. For me to fail to do this would be a deplorable incident of cowardice. You've shown me the courtesy of hearing me out. For me to fail my nerves at the end would be inexcusably insulting. This is the predicament we find ourselves in this evening, both here in person and watching online. God exists, and he cannot do otherwise. This is an inescapable fact, even for him. This being of infinite perfection, wisdom, joy, and love has seen fit to express those attributes by sharing them with creatures that he has created for the express purpose of communing with him and sharing in the experience of perfection, wisdom, joy, and love. We didn't have a say in the manner of our creation, but then again, how is that even possible anyway, since we didn't exist in order to voice an opinion? And so our Creator, knowing this, imbued us with the ability to choose. Step into eternal life with him, sharing, communing, growing in knowledge, feeling the immensity of that joy of experiencing true glory, or don't. Some of the creatures initially opted for the latter. The result was the only logical possibility that was available, the exact opposite of what God is: pain, suffering, malicious sin, in all of its aspects. And in so doing, they convinced others to join them in their folly, giving into halfway reasoned sentiments and ultimately yielding themselves to a state that is lunatic, raging against the deity who they recognize cannot be otherwise. And since God cannot coerce, and since God will not force anyone to bow down in submission to what is reality, in his patience he formed a plan, not only for the ones who enter or never rebelled at all, but also for the ones who made the mistake of failing to recognize what is so and cannot be otherwise. He stepped in on our behalf and fixed everything himself, if only you will take him up on the offer, because he cannot force you. I don't care where you sit tonight in your theology, deconstructing or not. If you're a Muslim, Islam says that Jesus wasn't crucified. Christianity says he was. Only one of us is right. If you're a Jew, Judaism says that Jesus was not the Messiah. Christianity says he is. Only one of us is right. If you're into Hinduism, that framework teaches that God has often been incarnate. Christianity says only once. And we cannot both be right. And if your cup of tea is Buddhism, that teaches that there is no eternal soul. Christianity says there is. And only one of us is right. How could we ever call ourselves followers of Christ and then permit teachings to come out of our mouths so theologically vague and harmlessly accommodating that it doesn't drive listeners to their knees in repentance? How can we know the profound and inestimable privilege of belonging to Yahweh and not go into an increasingly confused world and not urge everyone in our care to be reconciled on Christ's behalf to our Creator? How can we say we belong to Jesus and then have an attitude of apathy for those who have chosen to reject the offer? We cannot allow this. We must not allow this. Not in church, not in our own homes, and not in the hubris of our own selves. Hell is the place where those who choose to enter their experience something of which cannot be put into words. No amount of metaphysics can help us describe the horrors there. There is a fire that consumes but produces no light, a burning that scalds where there is no flesh to be found. The worms of one's hubris decompose your very essence, the weeping of rage in lidless eyes and the gnashing of the essence of mouths in overt rebellion at the fact that they finally are in a position to experience a reality where God has permitted them to have it their way. They finally get to be their own God. Hell, loved ones, is the best possible partial universe that you can create for yourself if you wish to be in charge. Run from your hubris. It is not logical. It is not profound. Run. You have to run. Please run. Do not listen to those who hate you and want nothing more than to hurt our Creator by taking as many of us with them in rebellion as they can. Run straight to Jesus, this Jesus, God incarnate. There is no other living water. There is no other light. And there you have it. Sinners in the hands of an angry God in 21st century terms. Exactly the same for every generation that has ever known life. Repent. Believe. The kingdom of God is at hand. And if tonight is your great awakening, do not leave here without being reconciled to Jesus. And if you wish to place your life under his care and take his hand, I'll even baptize you tonight. All right, let's open up for some Q&A. I have full transparency. I have plants in the audience this time. Things that I think you should be asking about. Plant number one.
Hi, I'm Beth. Long-time listener, first-time question asker, at least here at Community Night. So it's October. Mm-hmm. I'm wearing jack-o'-lantern socks.
Yes.
I love Halloween. I think it's so much fun. I know, right? But, well, that's the thing, is I love the costumes and eating all the candy I want and all the little kids running around. Yeah. But I know that there are different facets to Halloween. Yeah. And I want to know, as a Christian, what is the appropriate response for this?
Right. Teach your children to get candy from strangers on just one day a year. Halloween is hard because it's really an issue of discernment, and it's a wonderful question. I'm really glad you did that for me, Beth, because you don't even know where to start. So Satan doesn't get a day. He doesn't own anything. God owns all of it. And we can take, say, a holiday and turn into something that was once pagan, like Samhain, right? They bring that up all the time, the Celtic witchcraft stuff. And they'll be like, oh, well, they believed at this time, and it correlates with October 31st, and now we've got Roman Catholicism mixing with pagan traditions, and we're adopting them because it's cool and Hallmark likes cards and candy and all that stuff. But we can't ever touch that because that's Satan stuff. We don't want to touch that stuff. Well, yeah, I like that attitude. Like, we want the attitude of keeping that stuff as far away from him as possible. But are we summoning demons on Halloween? Or are we dressing up like Princess Elsa and getting candy? And so it comes down to a conscious problem, I think, for me at least, a conscience problem. And it's that, are we teaching our children the difference between dressing up and actually worshiping demons? Like, are we doing that work? Are we saying that a trunk or treat is the same as summoning Satan to come possess you? Like, of course that's not true. But also, there are genuinely people who are using this time period to do that, and we need to talk about the reality that's there and teach our children how to discern between the two. And we need to do so consistently, because in a deconstructing framework, we also don't want to teach our children to resent us because we weren't willing to explain things that are inconsistent. Well, Mom and Dad wouldn't let me go trick-or-treating with my friends one year, but they're totally cool with a red elf in the sky that drops presents on Christmas. That's all. I read an article that Christmas trees are pagan that one time. Why is that pagan okay and this pagan's not okay? And it's just a mess. And the best I can come up with is, you need to pray. You need to take this stuff seriously, learn about it, and your kids, and it's usually just kids, right, the trick-or-treating thing. Your kids well enough to know the difference between, I want to dress up like a bumblebee and go get some candy with my friends, and my teenage daughter keeps putting pentagrams on her arm, and I'm pretty sure she actually has chalk under her. Like, those are two different things, and we can keep them separated. But as far as Satan doesn't own Halloween, take it back. Let's take it all back. Let's make everything Christian holidays. Toyotathon, Shark Week, it belongs to Yahweh. It does not belong to Satan. So we just take a breath, but do the work. Something that's coming up truly, and I'll stop with this. This is for me, right? I have Disney Plus at my house. I watched Coco for the first time, the movie Coco, the new stuff. Question. Yes. Oh, Coco, okay. Yes. So, watched Coco. I have a almost 4-year-old, and a toddler, and I'm sitting there going, beautiful movie. I can play guitar. My son wants me to play for him. Love it. But I'm like, I know, I'm a Christian apologist. Day of the Dead, totally different thing. Totally different thing. This is like real Aztec necromancy being merged in Mexican tradition with Roman Catholicism, and the Roman Catholicism does nothing. It's just there. I don't even know how they pull this off, honestly. It's one of the most inconsistent things I've ever seen. So if I'm in Mexico with my kids and they're like, Day of the Dead, no, we're not going to go sacrifice food to idols to have them come do things for us as old family members. They'll ring bells and they're like, now the dead children are going to come walk through town. No, don't do that. Do not do that, please. But also, you can watch a Disney movie with your child and explain. And so I have to put this out there. Try not to blanket just anything that makes you uncomfortable, just chuck it. Do the work, because your kids need to hear you do the work and that you can tell the difference. Otherwise, I'm gonna get them in my class. They're gonna be completely and totally gone from Christianity, and it's gonna be because Mom and Dad wouldn't let me trick or treat. It happens all the time. And that's so superficial. So I don't know if that answers the question.
It did. I wanted to know if Dia de los Muertos was necromancy in it, because it
is. It's so actually weird. Necromancy. It's fascinating.
Yeah. I do actually have a third question that is not a plant based on something you said.
Okay.
And it may just be that this isn't something I haven't put together yet in my brain. When you're talking about hell being destroyed in the lake of fire, my understanding has always been that we all live eternally. Where we do that is the question. Yeah. But what you're talking about is not quite the same as annihilationism.
It's not.
But we're still talking about an end to hell and that level of suffering?
It's that intermediate state comes to an end. We're re-embodied, and that's the point, is that the phase in the lake of fire is it's a new phase. And that hell, the intermediate state, hell, Sheol part, goes into the lake of fire.
Okay.
And so that distinction is important to me to bring up, because when I'm dealing with people who are deconstructing on the hellfire brimstone stuff, they're thinking about like Dante's Inferno.
Yeah.
And they're thinking like it's across the board. And no, there are like phases. Yeah, so, and yes, there's a viewpoint. It's not a solid one, that annihilationism is possible. Annihilationism is the position that somebody will not suffer eternally, that at some point they'll be unmade. It can be made. I will never teach it because it's not a good argument. It's not consistent. But I get why people want to hold that position.
Oh,
So,
yeah. No,
yeah.
it's totally understandable.
Does that help
It
clarify?
does. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Okay, my question is,
Not a plant. Just kidding. Go
not
ahead.
a plant.
Full transparency.
If you're cremated and you don't have a body to go back into because it's burned up, does that matter? I mean,
Doesn't matter.
yeah.
Nah, God can handle that. There are lots of people. Like we ultimately we all go to dust if long enough. I mean, if you look at any mummy, it's just dust. Whether we're buried, whether we go through the internment process and we try to preserve. Now, traditionally speaking, the reason why Christians did take care of bodies and didn't burn them, which was what most cultures did, was because of that value, your nefesh. This is part of your design, and this is sacred. And we're going to talk about that next month, because we're going to be doing a lot of things that are going to come up with our culture, and one of them is cannibalism. And that issue comes up a lot, like what value does your body have? But no, Yahweh can totally handle somebody who's been burnt and putting them back together. Okay. Totally handle it. Not a problem.
Okay.
Yeah, we just want to make sure that when we're treating bodies after they've died, that we're treating them with the level of sacredness that they are. You don't just cast them aside. You don't do nothing. Della.
Hi.
Hi.
So, I remember I actually have two questions.
Okay.
Hi, I'm plant number 2. In the advertisements for tonight, you talked about astral projection, but that wasn't really brought up. What about that?
I wasn't sure if we'd actually need it. I started to talk about it, but sometimes I'm in a weird bubble world in university, and so like they are bringing in gurus that are teaching us astral projection, and like maybe you all never even dealt with it. Astral projection is the attempt to separate your nefesh, right, your body from your spirit, and travel as a spirit to be disembodied. Travel through either you believe it's a different dimension. Usually it's referred to as the astral plane. If you saw Doctor Strange, you know what I'm talking about? When she separates him out and she's like, you're entering the astral plane. That's astral projection. And there are lots of different ways to accomplish this. There's a lot of debate as to what's actually happening, or people doing it authentically. Is it mostly drug-induced? It can be both, I think. But what I always do with people who are interested in this, either way, is I take them to Reddit. You go to subreddit, Bad Trip, and you read every single person talk about how exactly the same thing happens to them. And they're not sure if they're encountering aliens or if they're encountering spiritual beings. They don't know. All they know is that after a couple of trips, these guys suddenly start getting really aggressive. They start getting uncomfortable because they're trying to physically withhold them, like deter them. And when they get back to their body, because they're unnerved, they find something else trying to get into it. And that's what stops them from astral projecting again. And it's like advice. Has anybody else experienced this? Yes. And it crosses every religion. So I don't exactly know. We do astral projection on campus. I won't go into all of the details. I'm going to say, for the purposes of this question, there are things that we're told not to do because we can't control what happens when it's there. Don't astral project. Okay? And if you need me to scare your child, I'm more than capable.
And the other question.
Yes.
So I forget. I had it all planned out how
That's
I
right,
would say
that's
it,
right.
and then there it goes.
That's all right.
But basically, what about the standpoint of why would God make people if they're just going? I'm gonna hit things. If they're just going to go to hell.
Why would he make them at all if they're just
because
going to
if like he knows all, he knows exactly what's gonna happen. Why would he send them to hell Why would he create them knowing that they would go to hell, other than their work on earth?
I don't know, because I don't know God's mind, but there are options. One of them is to give people a real sense of what our choices are before us. You ever had that person that was an example in your life, that example spoke volumes to you? I can see that being a purpose. I can see that under the framework for Molinism, for example, that we went over 2 sessions ago, that there really isn't a sense that we always know that they're always without hope. There's no such thing as a creation that for certain is without hope. But that goes too deep into some sovereignty questions that we've done on at another time. The point is that there are lots of different options for why God would do that. Sovereignty, because it needed to happen that way, because this person actually isn't without hope and that doesn't exactly exist. Are those satisfying enough options for now without me getting into a dissertation on sovereignty and free will?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome. And we did actually do a sovereignty free will session 2 times ago, and that is up on the YouTube channel.
Okay, this might be a weird question, but
That's okay.
if we're created with free will,
Yes.
and then Jesus comes back and we're all happy and everything's great, and we still have free will, what keeps it from happening again?
Oh, we won't want to.
Well, that's what I thought, but I'm
Yeah.
like,
What keeps it from happening again? There just won't be anybody who wants to.
because there won't be any Satan, or that'll all be gone, so there will be nothing.
Well, that, and we'll know when we're all alive. Like, it's not, you know what I mean? Like, we'll all know the story. Why would we ever want to be
Right.
otherwise? So we will freely choose to continue.
Okay.
That's why we can say that heaven's so amazing. There will be, there's a wonderful picture that C.S. Lewis does in The Last Battle, the further up and further in, that every step you take is so much more incredible than the last. How could you not but keep going further up and further in, and it keeps beckoning you like you haven't even seen it yet. Yeah, that's why.
Anna, it
Yes, ma'am.
seems when we read the New Testament that Jesus and his early disciples were regularly going out doing 3 things: preaching the gospel, healing the sick, delivering people from demons.
Yes.
And it doesn't, there's no real argument that demons have retired in the first century, but we rarely see that. We can certainly recognize when people are sick and we send them to the hospital or to the doctor. But where is the ministry of exorcism? Why is that not a more regular part of Christian ministry? How do we recognize when someone is demonized, possessed, or even under oppression, however you want to frame that? Corrie ten Boom, whom we all know as the woman who survived the Nazi camp, from the book The Hiding Place, she actually wrote a book called Defeated Enemies, and it's about spiritual warfare. And she writes as though she can be in a room and just sense when someone is demonized, when there's a demon presence, and so she'll pray over it and cast them out. I mean, I had no idea that she operated that way, but there's a little bitty book that I lent to a Baptist pastor and have not gotten back. So I'm just asking, why is that not the norm? And in my own experience, my having seen unusual things was very limited. And I didn't always know what to do except to be praying hard. And one of them includes actually a seminary student who in every respect seemed like a very genteel, mild-mannered, and even theologically astute, she was a seminary student, young woman. It was back out in Biola University. She was a Talbot student.
Wow.
At a vineyard in Anaheim, one of the small groups, our leader was praying, and this woman, who was mild-mannered, her eyes started to glaze over, and she started to burp, and she was not, it was like this throaty, scary sound coming out of her.
Yeah.
And I remember I was a college student then, going, okay, something's going down, and I'm praying, and my small group leader was not at all fazed. He's just looking at her and speaking it out, but I don't know actually went down. I mean, I was interacting with other people, and I
Yeah.
didn't really care to be there, as if, to see a spectacle or something.
Yeah.
But that to me also threw me for a loop, because I thought she was a sister in Christ, and she was not herself. There was a different presence speaking out of her at that moment.
Okay.
So, all those things are, well, how do we help people
Yeah.
recognize, and how do we help people?
Yeah. We're doing exorcism next week with our students.
are you?
That's, yeah. And so my brain is flooded with things. So, okay, number one, demons exist. Okay, we do.
Yeah.
Why don't we see them, was your initial question, more often? This is anecdotal. This is just Anna giving a theory. I think it's because our culture is misled much easier by other things than by demon possession. And why would the enemy use something that we already are like, ugh, we don't, that's like horror movies, we make fun of it, of course that doesn't exist. Like, why would he use something that we're automatically going to reject when he's getting us in other ways? So American culture not having as many of the possession cases as you might see elsewhere, and you do see elsewhere if you do any traveling outside of the U.S., lots of possession cases, and they're very effective. And I think we're going to see a lot more, especially coming up through the Caribbean and coming in through Mexico. And that's just because of stuff that's practiced culturally, regularly. I mean, our two Santeria cases with college students who have died were specifically for necromancy and for possession practices. This just happened. They were found in pots. They were taken. Like, the U.S. is going to be woken up to a lot of stuff, I suspect, on a spiritual level in the future. Hopefully not the near future, and we'll talk about that a little bit more next time. But I think that's why. I think the enemy can get to us a lot easier in our comfort than in shocking us with demon possessions. That being said, I am very, very, very serious about the fact that a Christian, a believer, cannot be possessed. You can't have both. So if you have a case where you think you have somebody that's a possession thing, you have to deal with it first clinically. And I did put up a couple of things on here. That's because I was trying not to go into too much detail on how exorcism works. You have to test for the mental aspect, because we never want to abuse somebody that needs clinical help ever. Please do not go to some quack in the woods, please, for exorcism help or anything like that. Come talk to me first. But as far as identifying, that was one of your other questions. How do you identify the difference?
Yeah, do I have to wait till that person's on medication?
So that's
it seems they were able to recognize it in the first century.
We can and we can always pray. And I would say it was where they were and what they were dealing with, and the robustness with demonology in the first century, Second Temple of Judaism, first century Christianity. It was huge. And everybody knew what was happening too and could identify it. So yes. Do you have to wait until they're on medication? In isolated places, I'm just going to say, well, I'll take it one step at a time. We can always pray. We can always pray, but we have to remain safe as well. So make sure you're not I don't want anybody sending in cases like, oh, I think some of my friends demon possessed, and then they go get hurt, because one of the things that happens with actual demon possession is that you do get hurt because they're outrageously strong. But I can train you on more details on how to identify that if you want. I'll leave that there for now, just so that we don't go a little crazy. Okay. Thank you, Caroline.
Hello.
Hello. It's okay. No worries. You're just trying to get it to come down so I could hear you. I appreciate that.
One thing for clarification, I think you said that angels who had the hubris to say, I want to be God, that was their free choice.
Mm-hmm.
Do they still have that free choice now?
Yeah.
To leave God?
As far as I can tell, I don't see a limitation. The limitations that have occurred is that they no longer have full dominion of the earth, because Jesus has taken that. So they're restricted. And that's so that the gospel can be proclaimed freely without coercing. So it's not, I don't want to give the impression that everything is exactly the way it was before Jesus was here, because that's not true. There is restriction. So where Satan was called the dominion or the holder of the keys to the earth. Jesus now has a hold of them. So that's where we have that, we should see restriction of angelic movements. I don't know exactly how that's going to look, though. But yes, so like when Paul, we talked about it last time. I don't know if you were, no, you weren't here for the last time. When Paul warns women, for example, in Corinthians about the head covering things, that has an angelic aspect to it, because he's reminding the women, like, there are other things watching you, and we don't want a repeat of Genesis 6. Cover up. And it's so, like, as far as the ancient audience was concerned, they expected that there would still be angelic involvement. Now, I don't know what angel in their right mind would rebel after having seen what Jesus did. So I suspect that's also an element to this as well.
And the same way for us, where we can, in our sin, choose God, or he calls us, free will, back and forth over there, can some of those fallen angels say, I want to leave this?
Can they be redeemed?
Can they be redeemed?
So that's a huge debate in theology.
Okay.
I have not taken a side personally. There is evidence on both sides that yes, they can be redeemed. One of the discussions comes down to when Jesus talks about the unforgivable sin and what it is, that the reason why he frames it in terms of angels is because he's not referring to human beings as being able to do the unpardonable sin. He's referring to angelic beings, and that they're stuck because they've literally blasphemed the only thing that could redeem them, and that's why they're not redeemed. Okay. Which is why if you're worried that, like, oh, I've committed the unpardonable sin, that's not possible. There's nothing that you can do that Jesus can't redeem you from. So that's the discussion, though, and there is debate on both sides as to whether or not angels can be redeemed.
And I would love to know and it's probably too long for tonight, the background for, I think you said the Nephilim, yeah. Nephilim, that once they were with human women and
did
those
what they
beings
did.
died,
Yeah.
they became demons. I would love to know the background
Okay.
on that.
Yeah, that's the Rephaim and the Anakim, and that's all those Hebrew words, and they're differentials for different people groups, and that these what resulted were giants, a race of giants, as a result of this, and that these are these incredible men of renown. So if you are interested in this material, and let me say this right now, you can get really bogged down in this stuff and start to get really obsessive, and then I have to start worrying about you because you're not doing what we're called to do. And I will step in and I say, I love you, I know I did this to you, and I'm sorry, but it's time to put the book down. Okay. If you like this stuff, the Naked Bible podcast is really excellent. And the reason why I introduced it to you last time and here is because you will not be able to get away from it. I guarantee it. I've already got people coming out of the woodwork about this. There's nothing new. It's just got synthesized, and there's tons of episodes, and we're all binging podcasts right now. And so people are just like, what? How have we never heard about this? We have. We've been discussing this for centuries. It's just not in podcast form. I'm sorry. So that's why it's there. If you're interested in that material, do that. It's all peer-reviewed, and it's exhaustive analysis stuff. So you'll have everything you ever need.
I don't need it.
Okay?
Hello. So I was raised Catholic.
Okay.
And I have a question in regard to Sheol. And is that the same as Catholic purgatory?
No, it is not.
All right.
Totally different, but I get why you go there in your mind.
Okay.
Continue your question so I don't mess
So
up.
is purgatory actually described in the Bible?
No.
Okay.
I'm very staunch on that. No, the idea that you're going to go, so purgatory, I'm just going to do this for the audience so that they know your question. Purgatory in Roman Catholicism is the belief that there's a holding tank after you die in the intermediate state where you go to atone for the sins that you committed in your life. And it's a temporary state, just for a temporary period of time, and there are ways that you can get time off in purgatory by doing things in life or by family members praying on your behalf or indulgences or things like that. But the point is, you still have to suffer for what you did in life, not permanently, but that's where that holding tank is. And once you're done, then you get kicked to heaven.
Yeah, and so that kind of further explains the question I had was, growing up Catholic, I know that they were, they continually pray for the deceased to get them out of purgatory more quickly or more favorably. And just wondering, like, where does that belief come from?
When the coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. It comes from, have you ever heard that before? It comes from a bunch of combination things that developed over time. But really what it was a discussion initially, if I could steel man this, initially it was a discussion of how does atonement work, different atonement theories, and then an atonement theory erupted that said, well, maybe we have to be punished partially, maybe. Like Jesus is, that's like he'll get us there, but we still have an element that we need to do. And then that was rejected by a ton of church fathers, right? But it kept going. Right? And so then it develops under Roman Catholicism over the centuries to the point of now we have purgatory being the point at which we work together as humankind to get each other out faster. And it was seen as like a ministry thing for family members, especially for people who, maybe they didn't have the best life and they might be in there for a real long time. And so you could do things like pay to get them out. And that's where indulgences come from. Interestingly enough, if you follow this stuff like I do, you can get indulgences right now for following the Pope on Twitter. That's real. Oh yeah? Yep, that's real. So is purgatory in the Bible? No, it's not. Are you going to suffer? Are you to atone for your own sin? No, you're not. It's either Jesus or not at all. And I'm going to be harsh about that. The Roman Catholics have it very, very wrong on that one. But that's, of course, they would tell you not to listen to me anyway. So,
well, thank you.
Does that answer your question?
It does.
Okay, good. AJ.
What's up?
What's up, man?
I know we're just scratching the surface on things today, and the demonic realm can go real deep from Ouija boards and witchcraft and everything.
Yes.
But
we haven't talked about Ouija boards yet.
But when I think about Halloween, I've also heard when it comes to like witchcraft and things, as far as like you may be celebrating it on dressing up as a bumblebee or something.
Right.
But I've heard of like people praying over the candy, and you get that candy home and things home and unleashing spirits in your house and things of that nature. And I think a lot of times as believers, I think we try to make everything fun, but how do you feel about you can really go out and bring these things back to your house?
I'll get there in a second.
How do you feel about that? As far as celebrating certain things, and
That's
you
a great
may go
question.
somewhere and
Yeah.
can you bring something back to your house?
Okay, so yes and no, and here's what I'm going to say. Can you imbue inanimate objects with something spiritual that can then attack you later? No. If you go to Target right now and you get a Ouija board and it's printed in China and you take it home and you light it on fire, you did not just anger the demon that's innate in the Ouija board, okay? Can somebody successfully pray over candy, give it out to Christians, and then that candy lets evil spirits into your house? No, they can't. You're a Christian, and it's just candy. So we can deal with that in that regard. However, when we are a person who likes to deal with spiritual realm things, and the spiritual realm knows that we're already peaked to be messed with in that way, can that be a way for oppression, not possession, oppression to come into your life, and for you to be like, oh, it's because of that crystal that my friend put in here, that they put a curse on it, they put a hex on it, whatever. Yes, but the reason why that's there is because you have alerted the spiritual realm that you're bait. It's not because the actual crystal has some innate power. Does that make sense? Yeah, so it's both and, but you never have to be afraid of specifically objects. They're just objects. You can have a very spiritually oppressed person come into your house and note that it changes the dynamic of the household. I've seen that happen before. But again, that can be removed very easily, and not by burning sage. I'll just throw that out there right now.
Hello. I have an afterlife question. So, when I was in college, this friend of mine, she was telling me this ideology she had. I'm not sure what it comes from or anything, but she believes that everyone goes to the space that Jesus is at, and no one actually goes to hell. Jesus preaches to everybody, and everyone comes to believe in him.
Okay.
I'm not sure what that is, but I was just curious.
Sounds kind of like universalism. There are a bunch of different types, but essentially that like hell isn't, although hell may or may not be real from this position, it doesn't matter anyway because nobody's going to go there. That kind of position.
Yeah.
So universalism is very popular. It's not a good position to hold if you take the Bible seriously. Makes Jesus out to be a liar, which is not a good start.
Yeah.
But do I understand why that desire's there? Yes. Would I love to be able to teach universalism? Yes. When Jesus initially was crucified, did he go to Sheol to talk to believers there and unbelievers there? Yes. But that already happened. And so we're after the fact. We're post-Messiah. So is that going to happen again? I don't see any evidence of that from the text, but I get why people really want that to be true. I just can't. I can't teach it.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry. Can't tell if that just confused your question or if.
No. I was more asking like where it stemmed from
Universalism
and stuff. I've never
very popular.
wasn't familiar with it.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome. Sadik, what's up, man?
Hey. So I have a question, but there are two premises. And
Okay.
the question doesn't make sense aside from those. So I'll go over those first if that's all right.
Okay, talk loud though.
Okay. Sorry, I'm not.
No, it's okay.
So the first one is it seems that, based on your talk tonight, that the idea of hell being the logical conclusion and a logical punishment for the people in hell is core to this framework of hell. Is that fair?
I think so.
Okay. And then
Hopefully. I'll change my mind if it's not.
the second one is that in the Gospel account of John, I think it's the 14th chapter, where Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And this has led a lot of Christians to hold the position that without accepting Jesus Christ, one cannot
It's okay.
one cannot go to heaven.
Uh-huh.
So if we put these together, then I understand for people who have heard of Christ and choose to actively rebel that hell is a logical conclusion. But people who have not heard of Christ, who have no chance to accept the Savior, that still end up not going to heaven, which presumably means they go to hell.
Okay.
I don't quite follow how that would lead them to like the guilt, positive feedback loop that you were describing.
I see. The problem with the folks who we assume have never heard of Jesus is there are several layers here. Number one, we know from at least Romans is what I can think of, the opening of Romans, is there's really no such thing as somebody not knowing God. And insofar, we could extrapolate from that there really is no such thing as somebody not knowing specifically the Messiah on an ontological level. That would be a hell-heaven aspect. So that's already a problem. I don't even know how to frame that, given that it looks like scripturally that's not even an option for anybody to even appeal to that. I didn't know. However, there's an entire movement of folks who are called postmortem evangelists. Have you heard of this? And it's specifically for this reason. Near-death experiences are being documented on a fairly regular basis now on a medical level. And one of the things that we're noticing is that we really don't fully understand death and when it occurs from God's perspective. When is the end the end? When is it too late? Because for a very long time, we thought it was at a physical expiration. But we're finding out now that actually there are a lot of people reporting that that's not true at all, even past brain death. And so these evangelists who are pointing out that people are finding, not only talking to Jesus, but also being evangelized to in this transition between physical death and the intermediate state, and that they're coming to believe in the transition all the way to the point of physically reporting being dragged by things down and calling out to God for help. And God does save them, and they come back and report it. And so there is a level of lack of knowledge here that we have to be very humble about when we talk about, when we're making big sweeping statements like, X person never got to hear the gospel, therefore X person went to hell. Like, yes, that's true on the biggest sense that it can be. Of course, Jesus is the only way, end of story. But in a metaphysical, ontological, when they died, X happened, we don't know. And Jesus may very well be showing up right then and there in those cases. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Can I
Okay.
ask a small follow-up to that?
No, you're one of my students. You can't. No, of course you can't. Go ahead.
So I think
I'm not trying to cop out. I'm trying to
Yeah.
be humble about the fact that, like, there's a lot we don't get to see.
So from that position,
Okay.
that there could be, even if we don't know how it works, there could be this way in which people who have physically passed away, I guess, have not spiritually passed away. Or that doesn't make sense, but I hope you understand what I'm trying to convey.
I think
this
so.
like physical death, but the soul has still this chance to meet Christ. What you were just explaining, basically. So
Yeah, like there's no such thing as a scenario where they're just like, it never happened, I never got offered it, and now I'm just in hell forever. Like, that's just, I also don't see that.
So doesn't that dampen or even attempt to kill like an evangelical framework that says that we have to go like spread the gospel so people can know and receive Christ? Like, does that go against that or dampen that?
No, I mean, it
zeal?
can for somebody who's lazy. We're called to go do this, period. It doesn't really matter what we think is pragmatic or not. So I would just say it's an obedience issue at that point. Like, if you tend to be like, oh, well, I mean, maybe there'll be gospel dealt with in the intermediate state, I would be like, that's not any of your business. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hey.
Hi. Okay, so this might be tangentially related to the question that was just asked.
Okay.
But, and it also might be like 3 questions in one question. But I guess what I'm wondering is, like, if you die and you have not accepted the gospel, you have been exposed, you do know about it, you
So
go
this
to
is
hell.
active rejection.
Yes.
Okay.
You get there and you're like, oh my God, I was wrong. Can you, I mean, I don't know that can you be redeemed in hell?
Yeah. As a thought experiment, the answer to that question is yes. As far as logical consistency, if what happens is repentance, that repentance is precisely it's the logical response, just like it is in life. The problem is that we don't have any evidence that anybody who goes to hell reacts that way. So it's not a can, it's a they don't. And that's why we see that permanent eternal stuff. But as a thought experiment, again, I'm just saying a thought experiment. Presumably, if I'm correct about this framework and I represented it well, that yes, that somebody that suddenly regretted it could get out. Yeah.
And so I guess, like, related to that, what I was wondering is, for people who are going through life and either aren't thinking about their faith or in a crisis of faith or any of the many places that we have been in our lives, like, if you, like, can you die before you are done? Like,
can you have a
like
premature death?
If you get murdered or if you die in a car crash or something and you're not consolidated with yourself, like you have questions and you have doubts and you're not like trying to reject God, but you are essentially because you haven't accepted it. Like what happens?
You cannot die prematurely. You die exactly when you're allotted. There's no such thing really as premature death. It may feel that way for us, right? Because we desire everybody to have a long life. But as far as just that, there's no such thing as a premature death, not really. And part of the issue and the pressing thing that Jesus has to us is we don't get that information. We don't get the amount of time. Nobody is promising that we're going to make it home tonight. And so the turn now is so important and so emphatic. we have to. We have no other choice if we're going to be rational about this. So no, nobody promises that we're going to be able to put all of our thoughts together before we die. That's the hard part. That's the evangelism part. I'm sorry. I feel like I know that's harsh, but that's the reality. That's why.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering because like, listening makes me think. It makes me feel like I need to go out and be more active, like, but not only with myself and consolidating my own thoughts, but like the people that I love and care about, making sure that they get a chance too.
Yes.
So.
Precisely. Precisely. Amen. That's exactly what it is. You're dead on. Thank you for that.
Thanks.
And if I can help you, I will.
Hi.
Hi.
So I had a question about what do Christians do about the idea of parallel universes and people going out searching for one that is aligned with everything they ever wanted?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't, like, there are things that physics people, I never took physics. I never liked it. There are people that are a lot smarter than me that know a lot of things about like possible worlds and parallel universes and different dimensions and all that things that I do not have the time to do all the research to figure out why. As an apologist, though, your question, what I hear when I hear somebody do that with me is, why do you need there to be another universe in which you exist? What is the preoccupation with wanting to get away from this one? Because that is a whole conversation that I can definitely have. So I don't know how to help you on a scientific level, besides it's fascinating, and the Marvel Universe is helping with expanding our knowledge, and that's very fun. And people are getting into alternative religions, which also deal with that stuff, but as far as I can tell, it doesn't really matter if you want to escape or not. You're not going to. Yeah, so there are more pressing things to talk about, and that would be, I'd go, interesting that you're trying to escape. Escape what?
And I had quickly one other question that's totally unrelated.
Okay.
People talk about like an age of accountability where children like are too young to understand and make the choices that would get them sent to hell. So what about that?
So that's real. We don't have an age of accountability, like a number or a time period, but one of the big ones is like what happens to babies when they die. They never got to hear the gospel. Does that mean they go straight to hell? And it's a huge debate in theology, not because of the conclusion, but because of how we arrive at the conclusion. So like, you can't actionable potential as a baby in a womb, that sort of thing. So there is no, evil can't even be experienced yet is one of the positions, which is why babies do not go to hell when they die. Same thing with disability, mental disability, same argument for that. But for the most part, it's fairly across the board that babies do not go to hell when they die. I'm talking on a theological argument level.
So then I know there's not an age, and I'd assume it's different for every person, but where do you count them as crossing that threshold? What level of understanding do they have to have?
Oh, I know. I don't know the answer. I really don't. And you'll have kids that are like really astute, right? And they're like tiny, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is a believer, and they've been a believer since they were knee high to a grasshopper. You can tell. And the kids that have been believers their whole lives, versus ones that are just, for certain they might as well be demonically possessed if they're not already. I don't know. We have to take it on a case by case basis, and it really just has to do with belief and talking to them and what's going on, and at the end of the day, being humble enough to go, this really is a heart issue after we've done a lot of this work, and we're going to pray, and we're going to let Yahweh handle it.
Okay, thank you.
I hope that's satisfying.
I think we're out of time.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
my question is actually for everyone else. Would you all please thank Anna for she was brought